My name is Jordan Mills, and for 12 years I was the senior grid reliability engineer responsible for keeping power flowing across 3 counties in northern Michigan. On the night of the worst ice storm our region had seen in 2 decades, I was sitting in the control room, actively preventing a cascading blackout when an email appeared on my screen. Asterisk termination notice. Effective immediately. Asterisk. At first I assumed it was a system error. Some misfired automated message from HR that had landed in the wrong inbox at the worst possible moment. I actually almost laughed. Then my dashboard logged me out. Security access revoked. Every system, every panel, every override tool I had spent 12 years learning to use with precision. Right in the middle of a grid emergency, with 3 counties worth of power hanging in the balance, the company had just fired the one person who actually understood what was holding everything together. And they had absolutely no idea what was coming next. 3 weeks before that night, corporate introduced our new operations director, Derek Lawson. He walked into the control center on a bright Tuesday morning wearing a suit that had never seen the inside of a substation. He carried a leather portfolio and spoke in the clipped, confident tone of someone who had spent his career in boardrooms rather than control rooms. Within 10 minutes of meeting our team, he started asking why the reliability department costs so much. I remember the silence that followed that question. Not the polite silence of people thinking. The loaded silence of people who know something the person talking doesn't, and aren't yet sure whether to speak up without sounding disrespectful. I exchanged a quick glance with Jason, my senior colleague of 8 years. His expression said everything mine probably did. That question was the first red flag. Unfortunately, it was far from the last. During Derek's first official strategy meeting, I stood at the front of the room and walked him through the grid stabilization software step by step. I explained the load distribution algorithms. I explained the alert hierarchy. I explained why extreme weather events, ice storms, heat surges, high wind seasons, required constant human oversight rather than passive monitoring. I had prepared visual diagrams specifically for this meeting, knowing he was arriving without a technical background. He barely looked at them. About 15 minutes in, he leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said with complete confidence, "Automation should make most of this obsolete." The room went very still. Because every single engineer sitting at that table understood one fundamental truth that Derek did not. The system was not truly automated. Not in the way he imagined. Not in the way that could safely replace human judgment during a crisis. I kept my expression neutral, but something cold settled in my stomach that afternoon and stayed there. For years before Derek walked through our door, I had built the stabilization platform he was so casually dismissing. It had taken 18 months of development, hundreds of hours of testing, and more late nights than I could count. The system predicted overload patterns and redistributed power across the grid before individual substations reached failure point. It was genuinely sophisticated technology, and I was proud of it. But I also understood its limits better than anyone alive. The automation handled routine fluctuations well. What it could not do, what no software could do without human interpretation, was respond correctly to the unpredictable combinations of conditions that extreme weather created. If the wrong alert sequence was ignored or misread, the grid could begin failing one substation at a time in a chain reaction that the system itself would accelerate rather than stop. Preventing that required someone who knew every layer of the platform intimately. Someone who had built it from the ground up. Someone like me. Within days of his arrival, Derek began reviewing every departmental budget with the focused energy of someone determined to prove his value through cost reduction alone. When he reached my department, he called me into his office and slid a printed spreadsheet across the desk. He had highlighted our team's annual cost in yellow. He tapped the figure with one finger and looked at me with the expression of someone expecting an apology. "Why are we paying engineers to monitor software?" he asked. I took a slow breath before answering. I explained that the monitoring was not passive observation, it was active interpretation. I explained that the software flagged conditions but that human engineers made the critical calls about how to respond. I explained that the difference between a managed fluctuation and a cascading failure was often a decision made in under 2 minutes by someone who understood the full picture. He listened politely. Then he moved on to the next line item. That was when I understood he hadn't asked the question to learn the answer. 2 weeks after his arrival, Derek made the announcement that changed everything. He had contracted a third-party analytics firm, based 4 states away, to remotely monitor our grid data. According to his presentation to the department, this arrangement would deliver the same oversight capability at a fraction of the current staffing cost. He used words like streamlined and modernized and efficiency-driven. I sat in the back of that meeting room and read through the contractor's capability profile while he spoke. They specialized in data visualization for utility companies, clean dashboards, trend reports, client presentations. They had never managed a live grid emergency. Their profile mentioned nothing about stabilization systems, cascade prevention, or real-time load redistribution. They had not, as far as I could determine, ever even seen software like mine before. Derek finished his presentation and asked for questions. I had several. I kept most of them to myself. I requested a private meeting with Derek the following morning. I sat across from him and spoke carefully, choosing each word with the deliberateness of someone who knew they were probably only going to get one real opportunity to be heard. I explained that the stabilization system required hands-on human oversight during major weather events specifically, because those were the moments when automated responses became unpredictable. I explained that the contractors would be operating a system they had never trained on during the most dangerous season of the year. He listened for approximately 30 seconds before interrupting me. "Jordan," he said, with a small, patient smile that made my skin tighten, "you're overcomplicating something that's already automated." That's a natural response when someone has been close to a system for a long time, but fresh eyes often see things more clearly. I looked at him for a moment. Then I thanked him for his time, stood up, and walked back to my desk. He had already made up his mind before I walked in the door. Meteorologists began issuing warnings about an approaching ice storm 10 days after my meeting with Derek. The forecasts were serious from the beginning. Freezing rain accumulation on transmission lines. Wind gusts strong enough to compromise elevated infrastructure. Temperatures dropping faster than the grid's demand modeling typically accounted for. The kind of storm that didn't just strain the system. It exposed every weakness simultaneously. I submitted a formal request to schedule emergency readiness checks across all 3 counties. Pre-storm substation inspections. Alert system verification. Contractor briefing on emergency protocols. Derek rejected every item on the list. He called them unnecessary overtime costs. He said the monitoring system would handle early detection and that the contractors were fully prepared. I documented his rejection in writing. I kept a copy. Then I went back to my desk, watched the weather maps, and began preparing privately for what I knew was coming. The outsourced analytics team began their remote monitoring shift 4 days before the storm made landfall. Within the first few hours, alert messages started appearing in the shared operations channel. Not crisis alerts, questions. Basic questions about what specific alert codes meant. Questions about which substations had known sensitivity issues. Questions about how to read the load distribution display during high-demand periods. Questions that any experienced grid operator would have known before sitting down at the console. Jason forwarded me the message thread without comment. He didn't need to add anything. We both understood what we were looking at. These were not experienced operators who had been briefed on a new system. These were data analysts trying to learn a live emergency platform in real time during storm season, while the weather forecast outside grew darker by the hour. I stayed late that night reviewing the system logs and checking every alert filter personally. Something was going to go wrong. I could feel it settling over the building like the ice itself. The storm arrived 6 hours ahead of the updated forecast. It came in faster and harder than the models had predicted, freezing rain turning to sleet, then to a steady, heavy ice accumulation that began coating transmission lines across the northern counties within the first 2 hours. Power demand surged as temperatures dropped faster than most households were prepared for. Heating systems all switched on at once. Industrial facilities pushed their consumption to maximum. The stabilization system shifted into emergency mode automatically, exactly as it was designed to do. My team moved into position without being asked. Jason took the Northern County feeds. I managed the central distribution hub and kept my eyes on the cascade prevention monitors. We had done this before. We knew the rhythm of it, the controlled, focused urgency of keeping something enormous from tipping over. For the first 90 minutes, we held it together. Then I saw what the contractors had done. I noticed it while cross-checking the alert panel at the central hub. One of the remote contractors had disabled a specific alert filter, the one that monitored early pressure buildup in the load balancing sequence. The system log showed it had been turned off 2 hours earlier, flagged internally as a dashboard adjustment to reduce what the contractor had described in a note as repetitive noise. I grabbed my phone and called the contractor line immediately. The operator who answered confirmed it calmly. She said the alert had been firing repeatedly and that it was cluttering their monitoring view. She said her team lead had approved disabling it temporarily. I told her, as steadily as I could manage, that the alert was not noise. It was the system's primary early warning mechanism for cascade failures, the signal that gave human operators the window they needed to intervene before one substation failure became 10. She put me on hold to consult her team lead. While I waited, 3 more alerts fired across my panel. And then the email arrived. I was still on hold with the contractor, watching my alert panel light up when the notification appeared in the corner of my screen. I saw the subject line first. Termination notice, effective immediately. I stared at it for 2 full seconds before my brain processed what I was reading. Then my dashboard went dark. Access revoked. Every system locked. Every tool I needed to manage the crisis in front of me, gone in a single administrative keystroke made by someone sitting in a warm office building nowhere near the storm. Security appeared at the control room door within minutes. 2 of them. Polite, apologetic, doing their job. They asked me to collect my personal belongings. Behind me, I could hear Jason's voice getting tighter as he worked through the growing alert queue alone. I could hear the hum of the system straining. They walked me to the parking lot without a handover, without a briefing, without a single transition conversation. The door closed behind me, and the storm kept coming. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a while without starting the engine. The ice was building on my windshield in slow, steady layers. I watched it accumulate and tried to think clearly through the combination of shock and cold fury sitting in my chest. 3 hours passed. I drove home. I made tea I didn't drink and sat at my kitchen table watching the weather alerts scroll across my laptop screen. Then my phone rang. It was Jason. He sounded like a man trying very hard to keep his voice under control and not fully succeeding. He told me substations were beginning to trip across the grid. The contractors were overwhelmed. They were calling the control room directly asking for guidance on alert sequences that any trained operator would have handled automatically. The cascade prevention overrides weren't being applied correctly. Load was being shed from the wrong segments in the wrong order, which was compounding the failures rather than containing them. How bad? I asked. Getting worse every 20 minutes, he said. Jason walked me through what was happening in real time, and the picture he described was exactly what I had warned Derek about in that private meeting weeks earlier. Without the correct override sequence applied at the right moment, the stabilization system had begun shedding load incorrectly. Instead of protecting the highest priority infrastructure, hospitals, emergency services, water treatment facilities, it was cutting power based on raw demand calculations that didn't account for critical service designations. Entire residential neighborhoods had gone dark. Then a substation in the eastern county tripped offline under the load imbalance. Then another one 40 minutes later in the north. The contractors were issuing commands into the system, but they were working from the dashboard surface without understanding the logic underneath. Every intervention they attempted was a guess. Some of those guesses were making things worse. Jason told me the control room floor looked like a scene from a disaster film. People talking over each other. Phones ringing from county emergency management offices. Derek pacing behind the console, asking questions nobody had time to answer. I listened to all of it quietly and said nothing yet. My phone rang again close to midnight. I looked at the screen. Derek Lawson. I let it ring twice before I answered. Not out of pettiness. I simply needed those 2 extra seconds to decide exactly how I was going to handle the next few minutes. The tone I chose mattered. The words I chose mattered. Everything that followed would depend on how clearly I communicated the reality of the situation without letting emotion get in the way. I answered on the third ring. Derek's voice was stripped of everything that had filled it in those early meetings. The confidence, the smooth corporate cadence, the mild impatience of someone certain he was the smartest person in the room. What was left sounded smaller and significantly less certain. "Jordan," he said. A pause. "We might need your help tonight." I held the phone and let that sentence sit in the air between us for just a moment. "Derek," I said, keeping my voice even, "you terminated my employment this evening. I no longer have access to the system." He hesitated before responding. I could hear background noise on his end. Voices, equipment alarms, the particular controlled chaos of a control room that was not under control. "I understand that," he said carefully. "But given the circumstances, could you possibly just log in quickly and take a look at what's happening?" I asked him one question. "Under what contract?" Another pause. Longer this time. I could almost hear him calculating, weighing his pride against the escalating damage reports coming in from 3 counties, weighing the cost of saying yes against the cost of continuing to say no. "We could discuss some kind of temporary arrangement," he said finally. "That's what a contract is," I said. "I'll send one over." I hung up and opened my laptop. I was not angry as I typed. Anger would have been unproductive. What I felt instead was something cleaner and more focused, the particular clarity that comes when the truth of a situation becomes impossible for everyone involved to deny any longer. I opened a consulting agreement template and began filling it in. The consulting agreement was 2 pages long. It outlined the scope of work, emergency grid stabilization support, and the terms of engagement. Response time, deliverables, confidentiality provisions. Everything a professional contract required. At the top of the first page, clearly formatted and impossible to miss, was my hourly rate. $800 per hour. I did not add an explanation. I did not soften it with notes about market rates or emergency premiums or the specialized nature of the work. The number stood on its own, which was exactly where it belonged. I attached the contract to an email addressed to Derek and to the company's general operations inbox. I wrote 3 words in the body of the email. "Please review and sign." Then I sent it, made myself a fresh cup of tea, and sat back down at the kitchen table. Outside, the ice storm continued building against my windows. My phone showed 7 new weather alerts for the region. Somewhere across 3 counties, the lights were going out one neighborhood at a time. I waited. Derek's reply came within 4 minutes. He called the rate unreasonable. He used the word ridiculous twice in the same paragraph. He suggested that as a former employee, I had some kind of implicit obligation to assist during an emergency, and that my rate reflected poorly on my professional character. He said the company would find another solution. I read the email once, set my phone face down on the table, and finished my tea. The other solution did not materialize. Over the next 90 minutes, 3 more substations went offline. County Emergency Management issued a formal grid emergency declaration. 2 regional hospitals switched to backup generator power, a serious escalation that triggered automatic notifications to state utility oversight offices. A water treatment facility in the northern county reported losing primary power to its pumping systems. Jason sent me a text at 1:14 a.m. that said simply, "Asterisk, it's bad, Jordan. Really bad, asterisk." At 1:22 a.m., my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered. The rate suddenly looked very different from the other side of a declared emergency. The man on the line introduced himself as Warren Briggs, an executive from the company's board of directors. He did not waste time. He asked me one direct question in a tone that had clearly moved well past the stage of negotiation and into the territory of simple problem solving. "Can you stabilize the system?" "Yes," I said. "What do you need?" "Full system access restored immediately. The consulting contract signed before I touch anything. And someone needs to get the contractor team off the override console and into observation mode only until I've assessed the damage." There was a brief pause. I heard him speaking quietly to someone else in the room. Then he came back on the line. Give us 5 minutes. The signed contract arrived in my email inbox in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. My system access was restored simultaneously. I was already pulling on my coat before the confirmation notification finished loading on my screen. I drove back through the ice storm toward the control center, and for the first time that night, I felt the situation shift from falling to fixable. When my access was restored and my screens came back to life, the picture was worse than Jason had described. The contractors had not simply failed to apply the correct overrides. In attempting to manage the crisis with tools they didn't fully understand, they had made a specific change to the stabilization configuration that had directly triggered the cascade sequence. They had disabled a core override protocol, the one that told the system to prioritize critical infrastructure during load shedding, believing it was a redundant setting that was slowing the dashboard response time. It was not redundant. It was foundational. Without it, the system had been making automated decisions based on raw consumption data alone, with no knowledge of which facilities were hospitals and which were shopping centers. It had been cutting power efficiently and catastrophically in equal measure. I looked at the system state for approximately 45 seconds, long enough to understand the full shape of what had happened and map the sequence of corrections needed. Then I started working. The first thing I did was restore the disabled override protocol and manually reinstate the critical infrastructure priority designations across all 3 counties. That single correction stopped the cascade from spreading further. The system immediately began recalculating load distribution using the correct priority hierarchy, which meant power started flowing back toward hospitals, emergency services, and water treatment infrastructure first. Then I worked through the substation failures one by one, identifying which ones could be brought back online immediately and which ones needed to be isolated temporarily while the surrounding load was rebalanced. Jason worked alongside me on the Northern County feeds, and we fell back into the same focused rhythm we had built over 8 years of working together. Within 60 minutes, the cascade had been fully contained. No new failures. Within 90 minutes, power restoration had begun across the affected residential areas. By 2 hours in, all 3 counties were showing stable grid readings for the first time since the storm had hit. I sat back in my chair and exhaled slowly. The control room was quiet. Warren Briggs arrived at the control center at 6 a.m. He walked through the floor with 2 other board members and a woman I recognized as the company's head of legal operations. They spent 40 minutes reviewing the system logs, the alert records, the contractor communications, and the cascade timeline with Jason and the remaining staff. Then Warren came to where I was sitting and asked me to walk him through everything, from Derek's arrival 3 weeks earlier to the termination email to the moment I restored the override protocol. I did not editorialize. I did not express anger or satisfaction. I simply described events in the order they had occurred and handed him the documentation I had been quietly compiling for the past 3 weeks. The rejected readiness requests, the meeting notes, the contractor capability profile, the system log showing exactly when and by whom each critical alert had been disabled. I watched his expression change as he read through the file. He looked up at me when he finished. "This is thorough," he said quietly. "I had a feeling it would be needed," I said. Derek stopped appearing at operations meetings 2 days after the crisis. No announcement was made. His name simply disappeared from the calendar invites, and his office remained dark when I passed it during my consulting hours. Jason told me the board had requested a full account of Derek's decisions over the past 3 weeks. The outsourcing contract, the rejected readiness requests, the termination timing, and that the investigation was being handled at the executive level without departmental involvement. Rumors moved through the building in that quiet, ground-level way that serious things always travel in offices where people are paying attention. The contractors were formally stood down from grid monitoring operations within 72 hours of the crisis. A notification went to the State Utility Oversight Office detailing the circumstances of the emergency declaration and the response timeline. I was not involved in drafting that notification, but Warren's assistant confirmed it had been filed. I continued showing up each morning, restoring the systems, documenting everything, and sending my invoices at the end of each day. Every one of them was paid without dispute. I consulted for the company for 2 full weeks following the crisis night. During that time, I rebuilt the stabilization configuration from its damaged state, rewrote the override documentation so that any trained operator could follow it correctly under pressure, and ran 3 emergency response simulations with the internal engineering team to ensure they could manage a major weather event without me in the room. I did all of it professionally, thoroughly, without resentment, and without shortcuts. When I added up my consulting invoices at the end of the 2 weeks, the total was significantly higher than my entire previous year's salary and bonus combined. I remember sitting at my kitchen table the evening I calculated that figure, looking at the number for a long moment. I thought about the termination email appearing on my screen in the middle of an emergency. I thought about the security escort to the parking lot. I thought about Derek's voice on the phone at midnight, stripped of its confidence. I didn't feel triumphant, exactly. I felt something quieter and more lasting than that. I felt the clean, settled satisfaction of someone whose work had spoken clearly enough that no one could argue with it anymore. 6 months after the ice storm, I was appointed to a federal energy modernization task force. The task force had been assembled in response to a national review of regional grid vulnerabilities, a review that had been partly triggered by the kind of cascade failure event that had occurred across our 3 counties during the storm. Our job was to develop new reliability standards for regional utility companies operating in extreme weather zones. I was brought in specifically because of the stabilization system I had built and because of the documented record of what had happened when its oversight protocols were removed. The standards we developed drew heavily on the architecture of that platform: the alert hierarchy, the critical infrastructure priority designations, the human oversight requirements during weather emergencies. They became binding requirements for regional utilities operating under federal oversight, which means the company that fired me during a crisis now operates under reliability rules written by the engineer they decided was replaceable. I still consult in the energy sector. My rate has not changed. I still charge $800 per hour. And I have never once had a client question whether the number is worth it.